Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller. And today I want to talk about the perils and pains of science fiction list books. And I should know because I've written 3 of them. I wrote 100 must-read science fiction novels. I also wrote 100 must-read fantasy novels. And for a bit of fun, I also wrote 100 must-read books for men. And way back before those, back in 1998, I was contributing co-editor of Waterstone's Guide to Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror, a real rarity these days. And the science fiction list book experience is an interesting one. At the moment, 2 of my favourite SF YouTubers, John at Sci-Fi Scavenger, hi John, and Jack at Sci-Fi Finds, are both undergoing reading challenges where they're tackling the books from 2 of the most popular SF list books. And Jack is reading through all the books in David Pringle's classic 1985 book, Science Fiction, the 100 Best Novels, while John is reading through all the books from Science Fiction, the 101 Best Novels, 1985 to 2010, which is actually a sequel to the David Pringle book. And I say this came out in 85. And my book, 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, which you can still get just about, came out in between those 2. So I'm going to talk about them. The thing is, it's all about opinion. These are books of opinion. And as Harlan Ellison, the great science fiction writer, once said, you have no right to your opinion. What you have a right to is your informed opinion. And these books are all by people with informed opinions. They are writers, editors, done a lot of reading in the field, work professionally in the field. So they have a certain clarity and a certain amount of kudos and reliability to go with. So their opinions have weight, they matter. They're not just some guy pulled off the street. The important thing to remember really though, is that these books are basically recommendations. They're a basis for your reading. And when you see people doing challenges, that's a very brave thing to do. If you want to do it, that's absolutely fine. But I can tell you that reading challenges of this kind can often ruin your reading. I know at the moment Jack is struggling a bit because as great as these people are, you won't always agree with them. So let's delve a little bit into that because these things come with expectations and assumptions. The David Pringle book, as I say, came out in the mid-80s. And it was pretty much the first book of its kind. It covered 1948 up to 1984. And David was J.G. Ballard's archivist. He had worked extensively in the science fiction field in a scholarly way and as a reader and as a fan in the 1970s. In the 80s, he moved into editorial and he was the editor of Interzone magazine for many years. Interzone began as a kind of successor to New Worlds magazine, and it went on to become a magazine which is still running. David hasn't been editor for a long time, but he really fostered it. And he was the first person to publish authors from the Gene Rats generation. If you don't know who the Gene Rats are, I'll post a link video to it. And people like Stephen Baxter, Paul McCauley, Eric Brown, a lot of those people, they had their sort of first publications and things like Interzone. So he was really seminal in bringing through the late 80s wave of British SF writers in particular. When David wrote this book, this was his English language selection, and there's a foreword by Michael Moorcock, and Moorcock says that, he's only read about half the books in this. And what David did, he picked a lot of things which are his favourites. However, he did include things for balance, and that's the thing to remember. So when you compare a list book like this to the books that would be your best science fiction novels, the ones which personally and subjectively appeal to you, this is a different ballpark. So he included some things just for balance. And have I read all the books in this? No. Have I read all the authors in this? Yes. Because taste is an important factor. And if I look through this, and I bought this when it came out, and it was a great book, it helped me a lot on my reading, and it was a huge influence on me. I'd already read a lot of the books in this. There were other names which were new to me, but it was a big help because David has a great style and great insights and very good taste. However, nothing would ever convince me that Wilson Tucker or Clifford Simak are really worthy of my time, and they're included. And the fact is, I've tried to read books by them and I've read short stories by them. And that's a good way round. If you're working your way through the authors, at least in a book like this, then if you find that you're not sure if they're going to be to your taste, you can always read the short stories. So this really is the key and seminal book. And I love it. I still pick it up now and it's beautifully written. And David is a great, great guy. And there's some absolute classics in there. And I would agree with about 80% of this, maybe more. And that's why when I came to write my book, 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, a lot of the books cross over. And I know at the moment that Jack is working his way through this. And then his intention is to read the dozen or more books which I've included in here, which are not included in David's book. This covers 1818 up to 2004. And when I put this together with Nick Renison, series editor at the Bloomsbury Good Reading Guide project, we sat down and what we wanted to do was get some balance. This is why the book is called 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels. The problem is, of course, people see must read and they think best, top, favourite. If this were my favourite and personal best 100 science fiction novels, it would be very different indeed. What we did, and we made this clear in the introduction, is we wanted to get across all the themes, the tropes, the historically important things, historically important authors, some culty things that people missed out, some personal favourites, to give it some balance. So remember, when you're reading through all the books, in books like mine and like David's and like Paul and Damon's, which we'll come on to, often they are applying a kind of professional editorial balance. Their actual favourites might be quite different. And the things which people would leave out, a lot of people would say, oh, you can't leave out Heinlein, you can't leave out Simak, you can't leave out this, that, what have you. But that's the nature of writing a professional non-fiction book. You go for a bit of balance with a reference book. So that's an important thing. So remember that. So the idea with my book was that you would read those books, or you would read about those books in the book itself to get a good overview of the genre. So it's very much that if you must read a lot of science fiction, if you read those books and read about them, then you've got a good idea of what science fiction is. So that was the aim in my particular book. Now, when Damien Broderick and Paul DeFilippo, two professional SF writers, produced this as a sequel to the Pringle book, going from 85 to 2010, obviously they're covering a short period of time. They're covering a period of time which is 25 years, which is quite short. They're also covering a period where science fiction moves from modernism into postmodern SF and the contemporary. And my personal belief is that this is not really an important period in SF. But even though there was some good writing and some good individual books, science fiction development actually slowed down. One of the interesting things about the books contained in here is that a lot of them only had one printing, a lot of them weren't published in the UK, some of them weren't published in the USA, and they're consequently harder to find because they didn't catch on. Now, the fact is there are many great books that don't catch on, and they are usually the most interesting ones. In science fiction and slipstream, the edges of things, the liminal spaces, are where the real action is now for the last 25, 30 years. So there are things in here which are well worth reading, but you have to ask yourself, why is it that those books didn't last? And there is a video about that in my members area on the channel. Members area, we call it the club room. It's $4.99 a month and you get 4 exclusive videos a week, and there's a backlist there, about 50 videos. So you've got 3 list books here. And as I say, people bring expectations and assumptions to them. And really, as I say, a personal best would be different, but these books are more than just a list. And what you get on things like Reddit, people will post the list of books and people respond to the list and say, oh, I don't think that should be there, I don't think that should be there. But context is really important. And in all these books, the authors, including myself, set out a context in their introductory remarks. And in my book, the most important part is the 3,000-word essay at the beginning about the history of SF. So context is pretty much everything. So that's worth bearing in mind. I remember being really annoyed when my book came out. After a few years, somebody posted a list of its contents on the internet, and the list of books itself means nothing without the text about the books and the context. So do keep that in mind. So as an SF expert for many years working in the book trade, having read SF for over 50 years and been selling science fiction books and lots of other books for over 40 years, What would I say about how you should pick and choose? These books are just a guide. You don't have to read them all the way through. You will not agree with them all the way through. Even though David, for example, I think is a wonderful writer. I think he's absolutely marvellous. I had the pleasure of being published alongside both David and Paul de Filippo in this edition of Deep Ends, the Ballardian Anthology 2019, and that contains short stories and work by all of us. Not short stories by David. David doesn't write fiction. And it was a real joy to be in the same sort of lineage of them. But the thing to recall is that instinct is important. Use these things as a guide, not as a be-all, end-all. Of course, your instinct will develop as you read over the years, and you will get a feel for what sort of things will suit you and what won't. And you're doing this when you go in a bookshop, you look at what's there, you pick things up, you try things, and sometimes you have to challenge yourself. But instinct is a good thing. Now, short stories, again, I'm going to mention them again because I think really a good way to discover whether you like somebody is to try their shorts. And most writers really show their mettle in short forms. It's the highest form of prose. Writers have to do a lot in a small space and they really have to put it to you. And because science fiction is oriented towards ideas, it's a really good way of getting one idea across. So short fiction can lead you into a writer, or it can tell you this is probably not for me. Remember, it's fun, it's not study, unless you want it to be. So there's a few thoughts on list books. They're not the be-all and end-all. They are part of your education in science fiction. The best thing to go for is big reference books like the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, which is also a website, so you can flip from one thing to another and hyperlink, and you're best of a hard copy and just sit down on the sofa and flip through a few hours. You learn a lot more. But they do have their place. But if you're setting yourself a reading challenge, remember that you're not essentially going to find that you like all those books. The secret is moving towards your own personal canon and working out your instinct. You will only develop that instinct really well by reading a lot, and it depends where you start. I was lucky. I started with great English writers like H.G. Wells, John Wyndham and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who all have literary reputations, which meant that when I came up against people like Heinlein and Asimov, I found them clunky and cheap. But when I came across Philip K. Dick, I thought he was absolutely marvellous, and the same with Bester and Dick. So it is going to depend on your personal experience. So remember, it's fun, it's not study, unless you want it to be. Bye for now.